So far in this tutorial series, we've been working from the perspective of controllers and their many applications. Next, I thought it would be good to flip the coin and take a look at sensory percussion from the perspective of what's actually generating the sound. We'll be covering sensory percussion's sampler and isolating each feature in a host of examples. Time markers for each section are included in the description of this video if you're more interested in one feature than others. The SPS file for this tutorial is available on my Patreon. Consider becoming a patron so you can play through this video without having to take the time to replicate the setups yourself. You can find a link for that in the description as well. If you've watched the previous videos in this series, you'll know that we've touched on many of the sampler's features already as we've explored ways of utilizing controllers. My hope is that rather than feeling like a review, this will clear up any gaps in your understanding of the sampler, spark your creativity, and maybe make the controllers feel less abstract. Some examples in this video use 3 drums. They are in the following channels: kick on channel 1, snare on 2, tom on 3. If you don't have 3 sensors, don't worry, you can do a lot of these examples with just 1, and most of them with 2. These volume and pan knobs serve as master controls for the whole sampler. Notice how when you put a controller on one of these knobs, a little colored bar appears around a portion of the knob. This is color-coded to the drum the controller is coming from. You can have multiple controllers mapped to a single parameter. When they are coming from different drums, you'll see representation of the drum channel colors. In this example, we're using 2 controllers to control panning of a sample on the bass drum. I loaded this sampler with a long ringing tone, as well as a separate sampler with a bass drum sample. Hit your snare drum to pan the ringing tone to the left, and your tom to modulate it to the right. Velocity determines the depth of the panning. One thing I like to do with this master volume control on the sampler is modulate it with an LFO. When the LFO has a relatively small range, it can act as a tremolo. With a lower LFO rate, this augments the velocity input, perhaps even bringing the sound in and out completely over time if you extend the range. You can also achieve some basic AM synthesis with the highest rates if you're feeling crunchy. The sampler has an onboard filter. This is similar to the filter found in the pad effects section, but it can only be a high or low pass. Mostly, I found myself using this as a quick fix for samples that aren't working well in my mix. You can modulate it with controllers. In this example, I'm using a random LFO for cutoff. Use the rim of your snare drum to toggle the filter on and off. This is the master pitch control for the sampler. When we modulate it with a controller, we get smooth pitch slides that hit all the spaces in between the semitones. In this example, the range is only 1 semitone. We can make this fine-tuning even more fine by adding a healthy dose of smoothing. Minute pitch shifts are a huge part of human playing. This is a great way to bring that into your electronic drumming. We also have the very dope option of quantizing pitch. There are presets for scales and you can make your own. Oftentimes, I just spell out a chord with this rather than a whole scale. In this example, you can use velocity to modulate pitch. With quantized pitch enabled, the pitch is locked into the selected semitones. This sounds great with some smoothing. Retrig determines whether or not multiple samples can be played back from this sampler simultaneously. In this example, I have a chord spelled out in 3 samples that are set to cycle. With Retrig enabled, you only hear one note at a time, even though the samples are quite long. Use the rim to toggle Retrig on and off to explore the difference between having the samples overlap versus having them cut each other off. Legato determines when the sampler updates the pitch of the sample when pitch is being modulated. This is best demonstrated when using a source other than the triggering source to control pitch, so here we're just going to use an LFO. With Legato enabled, an instance of the sample is only affected by the current pitch setting at the time of triggering. It remains unaltered through the duration of the sample, even if our pitch setting is changing. With legato disabled, the sample updates its pitch every time a new pitch value is received, even mid-playback. You can really hear the shape of the LFO with this setting. I set this example up so that the kick turns legato off and the rim of the snare turns legato on. Try exploring how you can utilize both settings while also playing a beat. Choke groups are similar to Retrig, but they are used to cut off sounds from other samplers. Here I have a long ringing chord on the bass drum and another chord on drum 3. Because they are both assigned to the same choke group, only one can sound at a time. This is good because the chords would clash if they overlapped. To create a choke group, double-click in the box, type a number, and press Enter. For this example, let's keep the snare sound in the choke group as well to give this setup a tighter sound. Trigger and stop are really cool new additions to the sampler. They might seem redundant, but they have special uses. You can map this trigger button to play the sampler from somewhere other than the zone to which the sampler is assigned. In this example, an LFO is triggering this reversed sound on the rim tip zone for us. I set this up so that the kick controls the stop button. This way, even though the sampler is sort of playing itself, we can still interact with it by interrupting it. Notice that the stop only takes effect until the next trigger is received. Let's contrast this with the stop receiving triggers icon at the top of the sampler. The kick is toggling the upper stop receiving triggers icon. As long as it is off, the sampler does not receive any triggers. Notice that when you turn it off, the current instance of the sample is allowed to finish instead of cutting off the sound immediately. Here's a more elaborate example in which this nuance is more pronounced. This sampler is playing itself using various LFOs. Rim on the snare turns receiving trigger status to on. Kick turns it off. Note that once turned off, the sound continues for a little while after. This is because the sample is actually a couple seconds long. Retrig is enabled and we're receiving triggers somewhat rapidly, so before we were only hearing the first little breathy bit of the sample. Once no longer receiving triggers, we finally hear the rest of the sample as the last instance plays out. Pretty cool. Continuing with this setup, but with the kick and snare rim toggling the sampler on and off button, we can hear that the main difference is that the last sample instance is cut off instead of being allowed to play out. This cuts off all sound, not just triggers. These top controls are really handy for toggling between samplers. This example builds on the last one by adding a second sampler that gets turned on when the other is turned off. The second one has the initial sample pitch a fifth higher. We have the option of enabling blend on individual samplers. For this to work, you have to have a blend set up down here in the main window. This blend button simply dictates whether or not this specific sampler participates in the blend. Here I have two pitches set up, one on the center and one on the edge. The blend allows us to mix the two sounds together, and where we play between the zones emphasizes one or the other. There are additional samplers on the edge and center with hi-hat and clap sounds. These are not blend enabled, keeping them distinct from each other. We have at our disposal a volume envelope. This allows us to sculpt our sample's amplitude. If you do synths, you're probably familiar with Attack Decay sustain release envelopes. This is similar, but adapted to be more useful when playing samples from the drums. Their behavior is displayed by the yellow shape overlaying the waveform. Let's use velocity to control start time. This sample bends up into tune at the onset. This velocity controller moves the start time up for lower velocities, bypassing the bend section. Higher velocities bring the start time back, adding the bend back in for emphasis on louder notes. I also set up a timbre controller to modulate the length of the envelope. Playing towards the edge will give you less length, shorter notes. Envelopes are a very expressive tool, not to be overlooked. Looping can be toggled on and off, and you can set or modulate the number of repeats. Type 0 for infinite loops. One of my favorite things to do with loop enabled is actually modulate the length of the envelope. This tom has a hi-hat sample on it. Velocity controls length. The changing length creates drastic glitchy results because we are looping the sample. We can also reverse samples. In this example, I have a low marimba note on the kick. The rim of the snare toggles the reverse button on the marimba sample. Notice that the envelope reverses with the waveform, so the resulting sound is truly the reverse if you're shaping the sample with the envelope. Let's take a look at what happens when you toggle the reverse button mid-sample. We'll use a sample of a major scale to see how it works. I trust that the sound of a major scale is at least somewhat familiar. We'll start with Retrig and Legato off. Hit the snare head to trigger the scale. Use the rim to reverse. Note that when we reversed it, it did not reverse from the point at which we toggled the playback direction. You might expect if we reversed once hitting the third scale degree, we would descend from the third back down to the root. Listen again with the scale degrees on screen. What happens when reversing mid-sample is that we jump to an equal distance from the end as we advanced from the beginning. In other words, when we reverse after hitting the third, we start descending from the fifth. The genius behind this is that the overall length of the sample remains the same no matter how many times you toggle the playback direction. Let's demonstrate this more clearly with a beat we can feel. No matter what you do, the beat will ultimately stay on track. Going back to the major scale example, try playing several instances of the sample before toggling reverse. Notice how once we reversed, every instance of the sample flips playback direction. Whether Retrig is on or off, the reversing still behaves such that the total sample length of each instance remains constant. With Legato enabled, currently playing instances do not flip, but the reverse status only affects new instances. This makes it possible to play samples forwards and backwards at the same time, as long as Retrig is off. In most of the examples thus far, we've been using just one sample per sampler. I think the ability to load several samples into a sampler and navigate them in various ways is perhaps the most powerful feature of the Sensory Percussion sampler. Here are 3 vibraphone samples outlining a chord. By default, the sampler plays all samples. This is great for creating layered sounds, but let's check out different ways to navigate these samples. Cycle mode advances to the next sample with every note you play. In this context, buzz strokes have a really interesting effect. Random will select a sample to play randomly with every note you play. More on this later. Control allows you to use a controller to determine what sample is played. Right now, a velocity controller is doing this. We also have the ability to advance forwards, backwards, and reset to the first sample with these controllers. Try turning off the velocity controller on the center and using the rim velocity controller to advance the sample that is being played on the head of the drum. To wrap up, here's an example that expounds on the random sample navigation. I want to stress that randomness is really useful. You might have studied chance music at some point and decided that's a load of junk. Then, when you saw that Sensory Percussion has randomness built in, you rolled your eyes because you are a more intentional music maker and randomness is cheating. I would like to argue that randomness is incredibly valuable when you're trying to do a lot of things at once. I have a bunch of percussion samples loaded onto this tom. When I'm busy playing a beat, I really have no business trying to intentionally navigate which sample to play. I curated them ahead of time for a specific job. Any of them will do. So that's what random is for. The variation is interesting and serves my jam better than a discernible pattern. Taking it a step further, I also have a bunch of random samples on the rim of my snare. This is an intentional collection too. They'll sound cool in any order and they have a discernible tonal center overall. Explore how random can feel good and even inspire you. Thanks for watching this tutorial. The next tutorial will be a case study of a full-length song setup just using sensory percussion. After that, we'll dive into using MIDI from sensory percussion to interact with Ableton Live.